the person who was at the front door. And he was standing there, and I don't think he was the main person. I think he was the guy outside who was waiting for them to come out.
I'd bet he was the lookout, waiting for the signal. He didn't fumble. He knew exactly which door was left unlatched that night. He knew the pots, the patio's blind spots, and most importantly, he knew Nancy Guthrie lived in that big house all alone. He'd memorized her routine. He knew which lights stayed on and exactly where the security cameras couldn't see a damn thing at night. He knew Nancy Guthrie's soul. She never saw it coming. She didn't have a single reason to think a wolf was hunting her. He was ready for a fight and ready to return. That kind of cold, calculated confidence doesn't belong to some random stranger off the street. You don't get that kind of intel from one quick drive-by of a quiet neighborhood at 2 in the morning. You don't just stroll up to a strange house and know the exact way the heavy, rusty hinges on the back gate are going to swing. You don't duck a camera unless you've already stood in its sights and mapped out the exact angle of its reach on the ground. You don't know which door's going to cave unless you've already spent time testing the ones that are bolted tight as hell. Think about the sweat it takes to map a house like that. You've got to see it in the high noon and pitch black. You've got to walk the fence line. You've got to stand on that patio and stare down those 2 doors until they're burned in. You took a mental picture. That door, that's the entry. You had to have a damn good reason to be back there. It was a reason nobody thought twice about. A reason that let you blend in like you belonged in that yard. A reason that made you look normal. That's the rot at the core of this, not just who grabbed Nancy Guthrie from her quiet home. That's the nightmare, keeping her kin awake. That's the question that's fueled 60 days of hard grinding police work and endless sleepless nights. It cost $1.2 million in reward money, endless canvassing, cadaver dogs, and knocking on every door in the zip. All this went down in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. We ain't just asking who, we're asking how he got inside. How'd he know the bones of this house so well? How'd he know Nancy's life the way he so obviously did? Maybe not her name, but he knew her patterns, her routine, and every single one of her many vulnerabilities. Now on day 60, we finally got a clear line on where the suits are looking. There's a fresh, sharp scent in the air. It ain't a flashy collar yet. No name suspect in cuffs. It's something much more surgical and more precise than a simple name. It's a lane, a hard direction, a dark corner of this case. The FBI and Pima County sheriffs are hammering with every resource now. They're burning every resource they got. If you follow the cold logic of this lane, to the bitter end, to the bottom of the pit, that's what we're doing today. And let me tell you, what's waiting at the finish line is heavy enough to break a man's soul. Stop and feel the weight of this horror. It's a gut punch that doesn't ever go away for anyone following this case. The FBI might have stared right into the eyes of the man who took Nancy Guthrie and just let him walk away free as a bird. The door, the pots, the gate. Let's go back to the start, January 31st. The night the world went cold and black for Nancy Guthrie. 2026. The more you stare at the evidence, the more obvious it gets. This wasn't some random accident or stroke of luck. Whoever hunted Nancy Guthrie didn't stumble in by luck. This wasn't some crime of opportunity born from a single moment of bad luck or fate. This wasn't a drifter seeing a door ajar. This was a tactical, cold-blooded entry by someone who'd done their homework on her daily life. It was a calculated breach. It required secrets about a private home that no outsider should have ever been able to get their hands on normally. Savannah Guthrie confirmed the nightmare herself in her first sit-down with Hoda Kotb since her mother vanished into thin air without a trace. Speaking on the Today Show, Savannah said those back doors were found standing wide open, propped like a sick invitation into the house. No splintered wood, no shattered glass, no boots kicking in the frame like some panicked smash-and-grab job. This was different, much worse. They were propped open on purpose. Seeing those doors swinging in the night breeze didn't make a lick of sense to the first responders. At first, we figured maybe a stretcher came through and they hauled her out the back. A medical emergency, maybe. But we were dead wrong. Someone jammed something in the frames, keeping them open like they were expecting to haul out a heavy load of cargo. Ashley Banfield says the way they were propped was surgical. The killer used Nancy's own flower pots to hold the line for his fast escape. He took her garden pots and turned them into tools for a sick plot. Everything was prepped for a fast, violent exit from the scene. Everything was set for a quick haul in and out of the house. Now, stop and think about what that tells a detective's cynical mind. Holding open multiple exits ain't what a panicked man does. That ain't improvised when the clock's ticking and the adrenaline's pumping hard. You only prop a door when you've already visualized the next move. You need your hands free to drag the weight of your dark crimes. You're moving a body or a heavy payload. You're planning on a return trip, and you need to know that door won't slam shut. You know which doors to hit because you've already mapped the layout and built a route based on every inch of this private Arizona property. The copper smell of fresh blood on concrete is a predator's perfume. Banfield says cameras and lights were killed. Nancy's place were gutted before or during the snatch. Think about the cold logic that requires. You must really know. Those cameras exist. Those spotlights hanging by that other back door that leads straight into the garage or a storage room. I'm not entirely sure what's behind that door, but it isn't necessarily the main house interior where she lived. Maybe he took those lights out 2 weeks early, just waiting. You gotta know exactly where they're bolted to the siding. You need a blind approach path to them that lets you snuff them out before they capture your face too clearly. That means you've stood right in the line of sight of those lenses before. You've seen them from a yard level angle. You built a specific plan for them, and then there's the detail that shows us the kind of monster we're hunting. A masked figure wearing a backpack was caught on one of Nancy's doorstep cameras just as the nightmare began to unfold. That mask is vital because it proves two things at once. First, he knew the cameras were live enough to catch him. He showed up ready for the surveillance. Second, he masked his face, not because he was some drifter afraid of being seen, but because he had a real reason to believe his bare face, without that mask, would mean something to a witness. He knew that seeing his face would instantly connect dots that he desperately needed to stay buried and totally disconnected. He knew his identity would bridge the gap between him and the victim, a connection he needed to keep in the dark. Blood was found on Nancy's porch. That is confirmed. The blood, the prop doors, the dead cameras, it all tells one story. This was not chaotic. This was an organized operation. This was someone who mapped out every heartbeat of that night and took every step to control the final, violent outcome. That level of prep work takes intel, the kind of boots-on-the-ground knowledge you only get by walking that specific patch of dirt. It's the kind of familiarity you only earn by being there. So, the question rotting at the center of this investigation is, before the first cameras clicked at the presser, before Sheriff Nano stepped to the mic, or the reward posters went up, who had legitimate access to Nancy Guthrie's front door? Not just a driver, but who had been inside those four walls? Who'd been lurking around or working nearby in a way that seemed so normal at the time that nobody bothered remembering? That is the puzzle the FBI is solving now, with the entire weight of a federal investigation pushing behind every lead. Regarding January 11th and January 24th, a telling piece of reporting comes from Brian Enton over at the News Nation network. Enton's been pounding the pavement in Tucson, talking to neighbors, and he's been one of the most rock-solid reporters on this. He doesn't trade in cheap rumors or chase shadows. What he reported about the FBI's specific timeline of interest is significant. Investigators, according to Enton's deep cover sources, have been circling back to two very specific dates, January 11th and January 24th. They're knocking on doors, asking if anyone saw a strange car or a shadow lingering on those two precise days in question. They want to know if anyone noticed a stranger taking interest in that home on those two specific squares of the calendar. January 11th is something I've covered before, but now we have January 24th, the Saturday before Nancy vanished into thin air. That is 8 days before the end. Both dates sit in the weeks before Nancy's disappearance on January 31st of this year. Crucially, both of those dates fall on weekends. Now, Enton was careful in how he framed this, so we will be too. He said he doesn't know for certain what the FBI has in their files. He wasn't going to guess on the evidence. They were scrubbing video from January 24th. They didn't say what they were looking for, but it was clear it was important. It was January 24th and January 11th. The theory he's floating is that the suspect may be someone with a job. We are talking about a guy with a routine, a regular 9 to 5, a reason to be elsewhere during the normal work week. But he used his weekends to do something else, to move through a quiet neighborhood without the cover of a work truck. He wanted to look like a walker, a neighbor, someone who belonged on that street on a quiet, sunny Saturday afternoon. Neighbor Laura Gargano, who's been talking to the feds, told Enton that FBI agents were laser-focused on January 24th in conversations. She also shared a detail from her own observations that she believes there may have been more than one predator involved. The person at the front door was just standing there, and she doesn't think he was the main player in this crime. She thinks he was just the guy on the outside who was waiting for the others to bring the victim out. It indicates that someone may have already been inside the house while a second person waited out on the dark porch. 2 people, 2 roles, and a level of operational coordination that turns this into a much more complex and terrifying beast. This level of planning means investigators are looking at an organized team, not just one lone wolf roaming the Tucson streets. Blood leaves a dark shadow. Neighbor Aldine Meister says the Bureau's been intensely grilling everyone in the neighborhood lately. Suits been knocking door to door, demanding specifics on dates, out-of-place cars, and any laborers seen lurking around. Standard interrogation tactics mostly. They grilled me on January 11th, and that's right when I remembered seeing that creep. I'd spotted a strange guy right around then. Suddenly, all the pieces started clicking together in my head. They asked me if I knew the date I saw that freak. I told them it was the 10th, 11th, or 12th. When the feds are still pounding the pavement weeks later, it ain't routine. It's a focused, predatory hunt for a killer. They're hunting a specific thread from those 2 weekends before January 31st. You gotta look at what a two-date pattern screams. January 11th is 3 weeks before the abduction. January 24th is 7 days out. The noose is finally tightening. If the feds are hyper-focused on those 2 Saturdays and Sundays, it's because they've already got a real lead. A digital breadcrumb, a cell ping, or a face caught on some ring camera placing a person or car there. This ain't some random guess. They've locked onto a person or a vehicle near Nancy Street on those specific days. Investigators don't sweat a whole neighborhood about dates from weeks ago unless they've got evidence anchoring those moments in time. Something dark happened on January 11th near that property. The desert ground remembers even if the neighbors didn't. Then it happened again on January 24th. The feds believe the same shadow returned on January 31st to strike. Think about the predator's mindset. If he was there on the 11th and 24th, he'd been studying her life. He had at least 2 shots to map her entire routine, watching her move, seeing which lights went dark and when. He was learning her rhythm, figuring out when she was home and when the street went dead silent enough to kill. He stood there, eyeballing those back patio doors, testing the glass, checking the angles of every damn security camera. He noticed those heavy flower pots could prop a door open. He felt the gate and knew how it swung. 3 weeks of observation, 7 days of prep, then January 31st. What was his excuse for ever being there? How does a wolf stand on a street without triggering alarms? The feds are spending every hour answering that now. They're in the grind phase. Was his presence connected to a job or a task that put him near Nancy's home? Maybe he had permission from a neighbor or a landlord or some contractor who hired him for a quick day's labor. That's the exact answer Day 60 gave us. On Day 60, that whole contractor angle finally cracked wide open. April 1st, 2026. Day 60 of the search. Ashley Banfield drops a bombshell episode on this case. It wasn't just an update, it was the most operationally heavy episode of Drop Dead Serious she's ever produced. Sources confirm the FBI and Pima County sheriffs are now tearing apart every single contractor and laborer involved. They're hunting down every sub and everyday laborer who had any access to Nancy's property or the neighborhood. They're looking at every single person who stepped foot in those Catalina foothills. The scope of this dragnet is massive. We aren't just talking about the big names with logos. It's worth sitting with how deep this actually goes. Not just companies with a business license and a truck. Every subcontractor that licensed company hired out to save money. Everyday laborer that sub brought along for a week. Every ghost on a payroll who showed up to move dirt. Every person who unloaded gear on a street near Nancy's home and worked within sight of her front door. People who packed up and drove away without ever giving a name. An insider called this process a total mess. When you see the raw data, you see the nightmare. Imagine auditing every person who touched a house there. They have to audit every single person who performed any exterior or interior work in that specific residential area. We're looking at those Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona over a window of several months leading up to the end. Think of the sheer breadth of it. January 31st, 2026 was just the end of the line. We're talking pool maintenance companies, landscaping crews, painters, roofers, and HVAC technicians coming to service units before summer. Plumbers, window washers, pest control guys, and general handymen who get paid through apps or by word of mouth. Home renovation crews that break into 3-person teams and work separate rooms. Electricians pulling wire, every one of them. Every one of those people had a legitimate reason to be near her property, a reason nobody questioned back then. They had a reason to be on that street, a reason that let them watch her without raising a single flag. Then there's the layer of complexity the Banfield source flagged. Something unique to this desert geography that complicates the hunt. This is Tucson, southern Arizona. We're less than an hour's drive from the international border. Everything changes down here. The border's a jagged scar where the sun bleeds into the dirt. The labor market here ain't no clean office with paperwork or verified IDs and social security numbers tied to a name. Some workers had keys to properties just 'cause a cousin knew someone. They showed up at a job site 'cause a relative heard someone needed a hand for 48 hours of grunt work. They're paid in crumpled cash under the table. Names were likely fake. There ain't no paycheck records, no tax forms, and zero ways to trace them through a database 'cause they never existed in one. That ain't about politics. It's just the investigative truth of the dirt. It's the cold reality of trying to solve a crime in this hellscape. That's why Banfield's source used those exact words to describe the situation. It's a goddamn mess. The paper trail's shredded into dozens of partial tracks, and most of them lead nowhere. Pima County sheriffs told Fox News Digital they're pounding pavement, hitting every single door in Nye's neighborhood to find a lead. They're canvassing from house to house, grilling residents about every worker they saw, every rusted vehicle they remember, and every odd job done lately on their properties. The feds even clawed back footage from 3 cameras on Nye's land, looking for shadows. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed the cadaver dogs are on ice for now. They're still available, he said, but the ground search has shifted. This whole hunt has moved into a darker, quieter phase than the chaos we saw during those first few weeks of panic. The task force itself has physically packed up and moved. It's a calculated shift in the way they're hunting this predator. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the union head for the deputies, told Ashley Banfield that the Guthrie task force has been relocated. They're in the FBI building in Tucson now, a joint team. Locals and feds sharing windowless rooms, breathing the same tense air. Not that we've been able to see much from the outside. Once the task force formed, they cleared out of our building and headed into the FBI building in Tucson. It made the flow of intel even tighter than it already was. And they did okay before they moved. Now federal agents and sheriff's detectives are working under one roof in a federal facility. That's a loud signal about where the center of gravity has shifted. It tells you exactly who's really pulling the strings now. This ain't Pima County running leads while the FBI watches. This is a fully integrated federal hammer coming down on this case. The FBI's got the tech and the reach to tear through contractor networks in ways a local sheriff's department simply can't pull off. We've got 5 of our guys, plus a sergeant, but there's no telling how many federal suits are tasked from their side. That leads to the big question. Just how many federal agents do you think are still buried in the files on this case? Hard to say for sure. I haven't heard a solid number, but the work hasn't stopped for a single second. Sergeant Cross was blunt with Banfield about what phase this hunt is in. He didn't sugarcoat a damn thing for the cameras. It's the grind phase. Most lowlifes ain't smart enough to hide their tracks, but this was different from the start. This one felt planned. Most people who commit crimes are amateurs, but this one appeared to involve real preparation. So it was never going to be a quick bust. That don't mean they're stuck. It means they're doing the agonizing work you do when a killer's careful. You weave the net one string at a time, pulling it tighter until there's nowhere to hide. Then there's the family, the cash, and the noise. The Guthrie family ain't going quiet into the night after all this time. They dropped a statement on March 21st, day 50 of Nye being gone, begging the community for a fresh pair of eyes. Their words were sharp. No detail is too small. It may be the key. That ain't just a plea. It's a targeted request. They're aiming at anyone who might have seen something in January near that neighborhood, especially on those specific weekend dates. They're looking for someone who didn't realize at the time that what they saw mattered. The family's reward is $1 million. When you add the FBI and 88 crime incentive contributions, the total pot sits at about $1.2 million. That's the kind of number that makes a man's loyalty vanish. It talks louder than any witness sitting in a box. For a day laborer who worked near that neighborhood and heard a guy bragging, that is a life-changing amount of money. If they saw a face they weren't supposed to, that cash is a way out. Investigators are counting on that math to work. They need someone to crack. Savannah Guthrie spoke out for the first time since her mother vanished in her Today Show interview. She described her family as still blowing on the embers of hope. Those ain't the words of people who've given up yet. They're the words of a family waiting for the moment the law finally catches the monster who did this to them. There is also the noise to address. You already know about the early reporting that pointed toward Nye's son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. Ashley Banfield was aggressive on that angle and cited a source she called impeccable, but the locals didn't budge. The Pima County Sheriff's Office pushed back hard on that narrative. Savannah Guthrie's family reportedly considered taking it to court. The air is thick with accusations and legal threats while the real killer stays hidden in the shadows. Imagine the copper stench of blood. Megyn Kelly confirms Savannah's livid about that report on Sirius. The family doesn't suspect Zion. The PCSD hasn't publicly named a single suspect at all yet. Nobody's in handcuffs yet, and I'm not in the business of guessing about some private person's life. We're tracking the law's real moves. On day 60, they're sweating every single hired hand they find. There's another woman, Nancy, who vanished from home, lived alone, and was truly loved by her town. She disappeared under a heavy cloud of mystery that had no easy answers in those early days. The whole case finally cracked wide open because of a contractor who had a legal reason to be there. This guy talked to cops before they knew he was the monster. Her name? Nancy Woodrum. She was 62, living in a Victorian ranch in Paso Robles she called Paradise Ranch. That name truly reflected her soul. She ran a local hair salon and was a devoted Jehovah's Witness. Everyone who knew her said she was the type to make you feel truly seen and heard. On May 5, 2018, Cinco de Mayo, she vanished right from her own bedroom. They found fresh blood at the scene, a nasty, jagged mix of Nancy's DNA and some unidentified male. That mixed sample was a technical nightmare that stalled the whole hunt for several long months. Combined DNA. Two people's genetic junk mixed together won't ever go into the CODIS system. CODIS is the national database we use to match samples against every known violent offender. So investigators had the guy's code, they had evidence, they had a partial biological shadow, they had the predator's signature from her bedroom, but standard channels were a complete dead end. All they could do was start sweating every person who'd been near Nancy's place before she died. In Woodrum's case, the biggest red flag was the workers and contractors on that property. She'd hired these guys. Paradise Ranch was huge, and Nancy was getting it ready for sale. That meant a revolving door of crews and contractors coming and going before she just vanished. Multiple people had a legal pass to the house, the sheds, and the whole damn acreage. One of those names was Carlo Alberto Fuentes Flores. He was just a hired deck painter. He'd been hired to paint the deck at Paradise Ranch weeks before she just vanished away. He'd been on that land. He knew the layout and worked the wood with his hands. He moved around that property with an insider's view that goes way beyond the front gate. Early on, Detective Clint Cole from the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office took the lead. He reached out to Fuentes Flores, not as a killer, but just a guy who saw something. Cole called him. Fuentes Flores picked up and talked. He was real cooperative with the law. He was cooperative the way guys are when they think they've outrun the badge's long reach. The call ended and Fuentes Flores went back to his life. He wasn't the main target. Cops chased other ghosts. Other possible suspects were looked at and then quickly tossed aside. The case hit the grind phase just like the Guthrie case. Months bled into more months. That blood DNA sat cold. Then the sheriff's office tried something very few had ever done. They did something rarely seen in California courts. They hit Google with a geofence warrant. A geofence warrant forces Google to ID every phone inside a specific digital cage back then. That includes Androids and the massive digital footprint Google tracks within a set border. Investigators drew a circle around Paradise Ranch and asked for every device inside that night. The digital data hit back. Two distinct devices were pinging inside her studio at 1:15 and 1:30. One device belonged to Carlo Fuentes Flores, that painter the cops already talked to once. The same guy who'd been a peripheral contact. He'd answered the phone and thought he'd won. Months later, cell data put him inside a dead woman's home at her hour of death. Cops moved in quiet to snag his DNA and prove what they already damn well knew. They tailed him to a diner and grabbed a Coke bottle he'd handled. Case closed. Blood doesn't lie, but it sure stays quiet until you force it. They took that DNA and stacked it against the male profile from Nancy Woodrum's floor. It was a dead ringer. They cuffed Fuentes Flores in December of 2018, over 7 agonizing months after Nancy vanished into the cold night air. In that interrogation room, the pressure finally cracked him. He eventually pointed the cops to her remains hidden in a remote patch off Highway 58. She was dumped in a rural, God-forsaken part of eastern San Luis Obispo County. He fessed up, went to trial, and got nailed for murder and rape. The judge handed him life behind bars without a prayer of parole. That's where he's rotting today, buried deep in the state's massive prison system. Nancy finally got her version of justice, but it took 7 long months and tech that was basically brand new to the murder game back then. It meant circling back to a man who'd been hovering on the edge of their radar since the very first weeks of the hunt for her. This was a guy who'd already looked him in the eye, answered their questions, been logged in a file, and then just walked away free. They finally tied that bastard to the cold, hard evidence that had been sitting in a lab database while he walked around as a free man. The lead detective on this hunt was a retired San Luis Obispo County veteran named Clint Cole, a man who knows exactly how ghosts haunt. You probably recognize the name from the Kristen Smart nightmare, that 1996 disappearance of a student that stayed cold for over 26 years. It took Cole's relentless, dog-with-a-bone attitude and the surgical edge of investigative genetic genealogy to finally break that case wide open for good. Cole ain't the type to hunt for cameras or headlines. He's a detective's detective, a guy who works in the shadows where the real filth hides. He's no talking head pundit. He talks about these killings because the victims still matter, and because the dead deserve a voice that speaks truth. He knows that justice for the stolen souls is the only thing that keeps the dark at bay, and there are truths only veterans understand. There's a specific way these nightmares play out that people need to understand, and Cole wanted to get those gritty details on the record. When Ashley Banfield dragged Cole onto Drop Dead Serious on day 60 to tear apart the Woodrum case, it was a calculated and deliberate move. The echoes between the two cases, the two Nancys, are damn near deafening. Both lived alone on big plots, both snatched in the dead of night. Both left behind a scene that screamed the killer had been there before, a fact that didn't slip past anyone with a badge and experience. Here's a recurring nightmare in these files. You've probably already chatted with the killer early on, long before you even knew he was a suspect. That's exactly what went down here when I put in a call to Carlo, our suspect, the painter, just to check a box and ask questions. Cole's become the gold standard voice, linking the horror in Paso Robles in 2018 to the hunt in Tucson in 2026. He gets the reality of contractor-heavy investigations in a way the true crime junkies sitting on their couches watching television just don't grasp. When you're hunting someone in a pool of people who had a legal reason to be on the property workers and hired help, it's a beast. The brick wall you hit isn't finding out who they are. That's the easy part. You can trace the paper trail of their miserable lives easily. You can dig through permit records, pound the pavement, and ask the neighbors who they saw hauling gear onto the victim's land that month. But the sheer size of the suspect list is what kills you, because legitimate access creates a massive haystack you've got to sift through daily. You've got to clear every single name in that crowd before you can bring out the heavy hitters like geofencing or tailing a suspect. Only after you've cleared the noise can you use covert DNA grabs and high-stakes surveillance to actually nail the coffin shut on a case. Cole chewed on a memory from the Woodrum hunt during a post-retirement interview he gave to the local Paso Robles press about the case. His very first interaction with Carlo Fuentes Flores was nothing more than a simple phone call, a routine check on a name on a list. He reached out to that painter in the first few weeks, not because he smelled blood, but because the guy was just another face there. Investigators were busy interviewing every soul who'd stepped foot on that property, and Fuentes Flores was just another box they had to check. The painter picked up the phone, gave his answers, and that was that. The lead went cold for months, until the geofence data arrived. What Cole realized about that early phone call has become a haunting lesson for every cop and reporter who's ever followed his long career. He said it plain. I learned a hard lesson in a major murder case. You gotta look 'em in the eye and talk in person. In our line of work, we had a mountain of contractors on that site. In Nancy Woodrum's case, the house was being sold off. A phone call just gives you rehearsed words and sterile answers. It gives you a script written by a man who's hiding a dark secret. But sitting across from a killer in a small room, watching his chest heave and his eyes dart, that gives you the real man. Watching the sweat break when there's a gap between your question and their lie, that's when the mask starts to slip and break apart. A predator under the heavy weight of a face-to-face interrogation will leak secrets that no phone call would ever let you hear. Clint Cole knew he had to stare into the abyss of their eyes and wait for the darkness to stare back at him finally. He had to witness their gut reaction to the kind of brutal questions only a man who's seen it all knows how to ask. That gritty, old-school method is what finally dragged justice out of the shadows for a family that had been rotting in grief and pain. After all that time waiting in the pitch black, the truth finally came home, and it came with a pair of cold steel bracelets. The scent of fear is a twitch of the lip, a dead silence stretching a heartbeat too long, eyes that betray a man's soul before the lie drop. Cole's seen that look 1,000 times, just didn't catch it back then. That brutal education, burned into his soul, is hitting the pavement in Tucson's Catalina foothills. These feds pounding the pavement in Nancy's street aren't just sending cold emails to old crews. They're boots on the ground, banging doors, staring down suspects across grease-stained kitchen tables or hot driveways, burning holes through them, asking about their jobs back in January and if they got any proof they were creeping near that block. Per the intel from Banfield's Day 60 report, Cole's gut hardened by the Woodrum nightmare tells him that in a mess like this, where cops are hunting every ghost who stepped on that dirt, there's a heavy chance they've already shared air with the killer. A name's probably already on a yellow pad. They might have sat inches away from the monster who snatched Nancy Guthrie while sweeping through dozens of regular laborers, giving statements, and they haven't yet pulled the strings that shift that name from the edge to the crosshairs. That's the blood-soaked Woodrum lesson. That's the warning Cole's screaming to anyone listening. The lawman who finally cuffed the predator had already traded words with him. He'd heard that voice on the line and let him walk. The digital dragnet dragged him back. Tech finally bridged the void between a scribbled name and a man in iron. That's the same cold tech and the same relentless police logic currently being unleashed in Tucson by a combined FBI and Pima County task force working out of some sterile federal bunker. The Bureau might already have his mugshot. Let's look at the wreckage on day 60. Before we weigh what Clint Cole's past says about this dark moment in the hunt, I gotta set the record straight. Here's what we're doing and what we ain't. This is pure theory. Every word today is rooted in hard reporting, Banfield's sources, Enton's intel, and the cold facts from Pima County and the FBI. As the press puts it, the dark road we're walking is analytical. It's a grim possibility. It's the shadow that grows when you press the Woodrum map onto the Guthrie file and follow the trail of blood. I ain't saying the feds have their man. I ain't saying some workers in a cell. I ain't calling anyone a killer yet. I'm saying Day 60's evidence shows exactly where this manhunt stands, what gear it's in, and the ugly truth of what's already happened in those interrogation rooms and Tucson porches. The feds and the Pima County boys are hunting every single contractor, every sub, every hired hand who stepped foot near Nancy Guthrie's place. They're working it, house by house. They're burning federal cash. They're in the ugly grind phase of a task force hidden inside of federal walls. And this whole slog, per a source who knows the dirt, is a disaster. Not because the cops are soft, but because the list of people with a reason to be in that neighborhood is a massive tangled web. And here's what Clint Cole's time in Paso Robles reveals about the Tucson interviews already happening in the shadows. Somewhere deep in that pile of laborers, among the names already inked in a detective's book, the blank faces that've stared back across a porch or a table, the guys who've already been grilled. Were you anywhere near this street back in January? Got any paperwork for that? You gonna hand over your phone? Somewhere in that mess, there's a face the feds have seen but didn't recognize for what it was. The Bureau might have already sat across from Nancy Guthrie's kidnapper. They might have listened to his lies. They might have already jotted his name on a checklist and crossed it off, cleared him, and walked away. If the Woodrum horror is the map, and every expert on Banfield's show this week believes it is, then the next act isn't spotting this guy for the first time. It's finding the digital noose that drags him from the cleared pile to the middle of the board. The geofence hit, the cell tower ping, the money trail showing a cash handoff from a neighbor near Nancy's place in late January. That one digital scrap, rotting on a server since the second he stepped into that zone, just waiting for cops to interrogate the right database. That's why they call it the grind. That's what Sergeant Aaron's "the devil doesn't knock, he just waits for a late bolt." Cross was right, this case wouldn't crack fast. Banfield's source knew it was a total disaster. It's a mess, but not from chaos. It's the grind, that slow, soul-crushing, methodical work that eats a man alive while hunting a shadow. It's about the exhaustion of clearing every soul with a legit reason to be near that property until you're left with the one liar remaining. He knew that door was left unlocked. He knew exactly where those flower pots sat. He'd mapped out that back patio like he owned it. He knew Nancy lived all alone. He'd studied her routine. That kind of intimate predator knowledge doesn't just fall out of the damn sky. It came from a service call, a job, or some quiet morning watching that house with a phony excuse that didn't trip any alarms. That lie put him on her street twice in January before he returned with a mask and a pack on that final dark night. He used every secret he'd gathered to finish it. Make no mistake, the Bureau knows they're hunting a calculated, cold-blooded predator right now. They're clawing toward the guy who held that intel. If the grim pattern of the Poses case holds true in Tucson, and experts say it will, then that monster's name is likely already buried in a file. It's been written down and logged by some tired beat cop already. Now we're just waiting for the high-tech forensics to bridge the gap and put a face to the evil hiding in plain sight. If you've got a solid lead on Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, call the Bureau tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI right now. Don't wait. Or contact 88 Crime. The Guthrie family is now offering $1 million for info that brings Nancy back home to them safely. Between the Bureau and 88 Crime, the total reward is hovering around $1.2 million. That's life-changing money for the truth. Every scrap of data matters. Every memory from January counts. If you saw a strange truck, a shady worker, or a face that didn't belong near that neighborhood this January, pick up the phone. Everything here comes from verified, mainstream news reports and absolutely nothing else. I'm pulling from Ashley Banfield's Drop Dead Serious podcast, News Nation, and Fox News Digital to keep the facts tight and accurate. That includes NBC News Parade, ABC News 2020, and the Paso Robles Press. We aren't making guesses, we're following the paper trail. Look, nobody's been named as a suspect yet. These theories are just analytical breakdowns based on how these cases usually play out in reality. This channel doesn't speculate or pin guilt on private citizens. We focus solely on the verified investigative process and the cold facts. For real updates, you need to follow the Pima County Sheriff's Department. They're the ones breathing the dust on this case. Follow the FBI Phoenix Division. They're working every angle to finally close this net and get justice.